When I was 4, I learned that darkness could stare back. Not in the movies, not in some midnight television chill. Scratch that. You learn it in the small, ordinary rooms where grown-ups think their children are safe. You learn it in the muffled hours when the house settles and every familiar creak sounds like language. Tonight I have 10 of those moments, 10 accusations from the dark. They aren't proof, they're memory, testimony, the sort of things that make you check over your shoulder and run your hand along the banister one more time. They will keep you awake. They will make the corners of your apartment look uncertain. They will haunt you until dawn. I woke to a cold pressure on my chest, like a heavy cloth, and I couldn't breathe. It lasted a breath, too, but long enough for my small mind to imagine stories. I sat upright, the room empty, and empty of weight, except for a single indentation on the pillow beside me, a crescent shaped like a thumb. The next morning, a small toy car was placed carefully beside my cot, its paint chipped in 100 small places, as if someone had loved it for decades. Years later, when we moved, the presents didn't leave. Objects boxed up with a certain scarf or hat would later reappear in drawers that had been shut. A photograph of my mother as a baby showed that same corner darkness in the frame. I don't say it was a guardian. I don't say it sought harm. I say that family houses keep more than memories. Sometimes they keep the gestures of those who once lived there. They visit the living in details only a lover would know. Whether that is comfort or constraint depends on the way you wake at 3 in the morning and find your hand in the air, as if to touch a face that isn't there. We carried the impression of that presence with us for years. It was part of the furniture of memory. When we finally left the house behind, there was a sense, uneasy and final, that something had watched the last box be loaded and did not follow. That was a relief, though not an absolution. It meant the thing had been attached to place rather than person, a note left in an empty room. Before we go on, if these kinds of stories are what you came for, and you like the deeper ones, consider subscribing. There are more like this over on the channel, and a few longer, stranger tales kept for patrons. No pressure, just an option if you want the late-night versions. Story 2. The Staircase Shadow. Not all visitors are kind. This next one came from a narrow hallway in a house where the stairs sighed louder than normal. Tom, I'm using a pseudonym here because he asked for it, grew up in a row of terraced houses that leaned backward toward the rain. As a teenager, he would leave lights on for long stretches, just to keep the hallway honest. I thought if there was light, he told me, shadows would have somewhere acceptable to sit. It didn't work. One winter evening, coming home from a night shift, he cut through the house in his bare feet, keys in hand, exhausted in that way that makes the world look like it might fold up. He paused halfway up the stairs and felt rather than saw another weight on the landing about him. It was the sensation of being observed through cotton. He looked up. On the landing stood a dark shape, the exact silhouette of a person, not blurred, not smoky, but a hard-edged shadow with shoulders and a head. No features, no eyes. It stood just beyond the top step, its edges filling the doorway like someone had cut a person out of night and propped them there. The thing didn't move. It simply leaned forward like it was listening to his breath. Tom froze. The house hummed. For a moment, he thought a trick of neon from the street had painted a shadow. He blinked, and the world returned to its ordinary geometry. The shape was still there. He called out, his voice thin, a question more than a demand. The shape didn't respond. He swore and climbed, 2 steps at a time, close enough to touch the dark as if it were fabric. His fingers met nothing but cool air. He reached the landing, and the shadows seemed to recoil as if embarrassed at being caught. At the same moment, a small light in the corridor flicked on, and the silhouette dissolved into a pattern of ordinary wallpaper. Later, when he told his parents, they laughed and told him he'd been alone too long. It happened again the next week, this time in his bedroom mirror. He was washing his face, steam on the glass, when he saw movement behind him. Turning, he froze, because the mirror reflected a silhouette with bright red eyes. He told me he doesn't like to use the word eyes because that suggests intention, something that can look back at you and count you. These were more like holes that held light, 2 pinpricks that seared through the reflection. He faced the mirror, and the red dots blinked as if they were camera lenses focusing. He left a mark the night that followed. His bedside lamp was slammed down, shade skewed, the photograph on the dresser knocked face down. There were small scuff marks on the floor, like someone had dragged something heavy and sharp across the planks. For a week, he woke to the sound of someone pacing above his ceiling when no one lived there. Tom moved out within the month. He sold the flat and took a job across the country. Yet every now and then he will say, almost apologetically, "I can't look in a mirror if it's dark." He is not afraid of the dark itself. He's afraid of the way things in the dark might be waiting politely behind the surface of reflection. Story 3, Sarah. The most chilling of these stories is also the saddest, because grief colors every detail. Names will be shifted and towns anonymized. The girl in this story is called Sarah by the people who remember her. She belongs to no one now, and to everyone who asks.
It began small and domestic. A child who had been allowed to roam the block, someone parents trusted, was gone one summer evening. There was a search, flyers, a community that organized itself into light. They found no tidy answer. Time passed, and the case grew cold even as the quiet grew loud with the absence. The family moved homes twice, but in each house that child had inhabited, people reported the same tiny acts. A toy placed at the foot of the grown child's bed as if to comfort him. Small footprints in dust where a child could have stepped. The sense of a presence settled in the corner like a thought. Witnesses, neighbors, friends, people who had taken in the lost and the grieving, spoke of a young spirit who refused to stay lost. One woman I spoke to had cared for a boy who kept waking at 2 a.m.
and claiming the little girl slept on the floor beside him. She'd hum, the woman said. Not words we knew, just a tune. The mattress would show an indentation in the morning, an imprint of a small body. Sometimes the sheets bore the faint smell of something sweet and old, like the wash from the 70s. Other nights there would be an extra spoon in the sink, placed with the sort of careful cruelty that proves absence to be presence by practical means. When people went looking for Sarah in the places where the family had stayed, they reported seeing a childish shape briefly reflected in car windows, a small shadow under a street lamp. Hounds seemed to circle at certain corners, as if scenting a memory. A retired policeman, the sort who had worked too many cases and kept clippings in a drawer, sent a letter in which he wrote, "It's as if she refuses to be erased." There are two aspects that twist around this story and won't let go. First, sometimes the presence was physical. A mother's bedsheet would be damp where the ghost had bothered to curl, or a blanket would be found folded neatly at the foot of a bed. Second, sometimes only certain people could see her. Siblings, mothers, and aunt, people connected by blood and grief, would speak of a small shadow at the end of a hallway. Strangers, tradesmen, and passing friends would not. It made the phenomenon partial and private, intimate like a family secret said aloud. That partial visibility is one of the meanest things about hauntings. Ordinary life requires witnesses, teachers, grocers, bus drivers, people who verify your presence by chance encounters. When only those closest to you can see what's there, grief becomes solipsistic. They described nights where the house sighed differently, where the kitchen sink's faucet would drip in small rhythms that matched a lullaby. They described a child's handprint on a fogged mirror, smudged and child-sized. No one said the air felt malevolent. Instead, it felt eternally waiting. For the family, the unresolved case of Sarah became a shadow that followed them like a scent. Missing persons investigators who continued to follow the file sometimes reported a photograph that looked like two children on a pavement, one blurred as if running, while the other stood still and small, her hair plastered by rain. In the photo you can see a patch of light where her eyes might have been. Nothing conclusive, only impression. The question at the center, why she stayed, doesn't have an answer. Was she tethered to the people who loved her, continuing the dull work of being remembered? Was she refusing to move beyond a geography of pain? Or was the world simply porous for certain people? As with many of these accounts, the more you try to pin down motive, the less you know. What remains are objects and habits. A child's shoe left by the back door. A doll that appears on a porch when no one owns one. The faint, impossible sound of small feet in the attic.
You will notice by now a pattern. Hauntings attach themselves to threads. Homes, items, kids, rituals. They don't always make sense. They leave questions. Story 4. The Doll and the Funko. Objects anchor hauntings more often than rooms. A charm bracelet, a rusted key, a small statue. Leave them long enough in the world, and sometimes they accumulate attentions. The next two stories are about things that shouldn't be able to watch, porcelain and plastic. In the first account, a collector of antiques, call her Claire, bought a doll at a market because it had an odd face. It wasn't ugly, it was unfinished. The paint had flaked in one cheek, and one glass eye seemed clouded. She brought it home because she liked things with histories. People like this collect the sort of quiet ghosts you can hold. For a week, the doll sat on a shelf, right beside a stack of books. Claire noticed small changes at first. Books slid a few millimeters, the sound of a tiny footfall in the hollow of the cabinet. Then things escalated. A cup of tea left on the coffee table would end up on the floor as if pushed. Once the doll was found lying on its face,
its sewn mouth pressed hard to the rug. Claire said she would wake at the same hour every night to the sense of being watched. Once, while staying in, she dreamt a small hand tapped the edge of her bed. The next morning, there were 3 indentations on the margin of the mattress, exactly the size and pattern her hand would make if someone had pressed it there. She moved the doll to a box and locked it away. The tapping stopped for a night, and then another small sound in the walls began, soft, like pins being struck. The other object was more modern and more stubborn, a Funko Pop, a little vinyl toy with exaggerated eyes, purchased as a gag for a friend's birthday. The roommate, who we'll call Jenna, kept it on the dashboard of her car. After a while, she started to find the pop in different places, in the sink, under her pillow, facing the wall. The group joked about it until the night Jenna came home and said, trembling, it was on the stairs. It was looking down. A smaller story within this one, their spider-like roommate, nicknamed Simon because of the way he skittered through the house, picked up the pop one afternoon and said, deadpan, it creeps me out. 2 days later, Simon woke in the night and insisted that something had been sitting on his chest. He called it a Spider-Man because it felt like a weight with long, thin limbs. After that, Simon stopped sleeping in the house. He left a note saying he'd found a flat in town and that he didn't want to explain why. He didn't come back. What ties these object stories together is how quickly the inanimate turns invasive. A doll doesn't need to inhabit a body to press itself into your routine. A small figure on a dashboard shouldn't be able to stare at you across a room and change the tenor of a house. Yet they do.
Objects are good anchors because they move. They come and go with you. A cursed figurine in a bag becomes a companion across cities. A haunted Funko in a pocket is privacy violated. It makes the haunt portable and therefore impossible to escape. Story 5. The Leathery Woman. There are stories that are tender, stories that are sad, and then there are stories that leave an immediate bruise. This one is sharp and tactile, an episode of physical presence that doesn't cross into the explicit, but which communicates urgency through texture and weight. I remember this one as if it were filmed from inside a throat. A teenager, call her Anna, slept in a bedroom the size of a postage stamp. She told me that she had always had nightmares as a child, the kind that anchor themselves in the shoulders. On a night when the house was soaked with rain, she felt the bed press down as though someone had sat heavily on the covers. At first, she thought it was a sibling, a practical joke. The house was empty. Then she felt, on her calf, something like leathery skin. Not animal hair, but a tough, warm rubber, an impression that traced slow circles. She fought, instinctual and half asleep, to remove the feeling. Her hands found nothing but sheet and linen. She flung the covers back, and the room was a geometry of furniture and moonlight. There was nothing on the bed. The morning showed the kind of imprint some memories leave. Fingernail marks on the wooden frame of the bed, shallow and irregular, as if some fingers had tried to grab themselves motionless. Anna told me about the noise that accompanied the sensation, a low grating sound like distant machinery, like someone grinding leather. She left the house that day and didn't return before afternoon. For months she avoided the room. Even years after, she reported the sensation of being watched, the way you physically feel wind before rain. This wasn't an isolated event. Different tenants in the same house later reported a figure moving through the hall, something that did not have the soft edge of skin, but instead had a tightness like dried hide. Doors would slam with the concentrated force of a pushed palm. Once, someone found the couch cushions arranged in a pattern that looked like the weight of a small body curled deliberately. Anna moved away for university, and then across the sea. The house stayed behind, an old thing full of grain and memory. When she visited in holidays, she could sometimes feel the old pressure in passing, as if the house remembered how to press against her sleep. It is the remembered weight that is the worst, not the moment itself, but the way your own body continues to brace against a sensation when the world is safe. Story 6. Little Flower Haven. Some places keep a particular kind of grief. Little Flower Haven used to be a convent and was later turned into a small rental property and eventually an office for a local charity.
The place deliberately carried its past like an ill-fitting shawl, and people who worked there said the silence had a particular knuckle of sorrow. A volunteer named Marta told me about that place. She would arrive for early shifts and find candles unlit that she was sure had been lit the night before. Her phone would pick up low voices when she stood in the back corridor. fragments of Latin that might have been memory rather than speech. During one late shift, a FaceTime call she was on registered an impossible audio event, voices singing, and in the footage a faint shape of a nun-like figure standing at the end of a corridor. When she asked the person on the other end if they could see it, the other person on the line only said, "That's just the reflection," even though there had been no bright light to reflect. People there took photographs the way people living with a known past will take pictures, trying and failing to prove something beyond the frame. A volunteer submitted a photo to the local paper showing a window where a white figure stood, its outline blurred as water is, and in the negative space where its face might be were long shadows like tears. The volunteers argued about whether the figures were residual, leftover impressions from a life once lived, or active, capable of noticing and moving. The most affecting account came from an older man who ran the garden. He had lived in the nearby village his whole life, and believed the place had been built near a forgotten plot. The day he died, some said, he walked into the chapel and sat quietly for a long time. He later told a neighbor that he'd seen children playing in the courtyard where there were none, and that they had asked him to come inside because it was raining. They looked tired, he said, not angry, tired. In a place like that, the presence you feel is not malevolent, it is worn out. Sometimes the saddest things follow you because they never had the chance to leave. There was one final, unnerving detail. A priest who came to conduct a small blessing, routine work, nothing dramatic, left his cassock folded oddly, as if someone had smoothed it and set it down for him. He swore later that when he went to collect his garment, the collar bore a faint damp circle, like the mark of a small hand. He folded it carefully, put it on, and felt watched down to the buttons. Whether the watchers were pitying or predatory, no one decided. They simply made the place feel thinner, like an old photograph left in the rain. At the end of her shift one night, Marta said, she walked out into the courtyard and found a child's shoe on a bench. No one there owned it. The shoe was small and patched at the heel, as if it had been worn by someone who had walked a long way and kept walking. We could let the story of Little Flower Haven rest on that image, and it would be enough. A shoe, an abandoned child's joke of a thing, wearing its history in the stitch of a soul.
But hauntings rarely sit still. They move between objects, people, and places, and sometimes they step into the footprints of other stories. There are more rooms, more objects, more people who have been watched, who have been tapped, who have felt the cold mouth of remembering at their neck. Some of them are protectors, some of them are pests, and some of them are stubborn questions with no answer. Up next are stories of longer attachments, things that followed people across moves and had no idea how to let go. If you've made it this far, you already know the tone is shifting. What starts as small and personal often turns territorial. These next accounts will push harder, a follower from across borders, across throne. And keep in mind that sometimes the most dangerous thing a haunting does is refuse to stay put. There, in the hallway, the floorboards groan in a way that sounds like a conversation. You think it's the house, and maybe it is, but houses keep secrets, and sometimes they trade them with the living. Remember that when you tuck the blanket over your shoulder tonight, you might be settling under someone else's memory. Story 7 begins in a different country and in a different kind of sleep, one that never fully stops. Story 7, The Border Follower. They say some histories cross borders the way weather does, quietly, without passport checks, carried on the soles of shoes and in the folds of children's clothes. This next tale begins in a small border town, a place where two languages warm into one another, and everyone knows which houses are for sale and which are simply waiting. Maria, I'll use that name because it fit the cadence of the woman who told me, grew up in a house that had never been renovated. Floorboards hummed. The front door had a brass knob that never quite shined. When she married and moved out, she took with her only a few things: a wedding ring, a faded blanket from her mother, and a rosary that had belonged to a grandmother who liked to keep the family tidy. The rosary, she said, was the sort of object people touched when the world felt too loud. It smelled faintly of laundry powder and lemon oil. Not long after she'd settled into her first apartment with her husband, small things began to misbehave.
The rosary, kept in a jewelry box, would be on the kitchen table in the morning when she'd last remember closing the box. A photograph from her wedding was face down on the bedside table. Her husband blamed sleepwalking. Then came the scratches on her arm that appeared while she slept, shallow and arranged like tiny, neat bees. They would fade but never vanish from the way she remembered them being felt. Little pinpoints of annoyance, then a dull ache. One night, the sound that woke her wasn't a creak, but a snuffling, small animal breaths at the doorway. She reached for the lamp and felt the air change, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had no window.
When the light came on, there was nothing there but a faint dark shadow in the corner, like soot left after a fire. Her husband laughed it off until he started to hear the same snuffling at night and saw the rosary moved from its box to the edge of their sink. Neighbors would later say they'd seen a woman walking at the edge of the street who fit no recent description, an older woman, black headscarf, slow steps. She walked as if she were looking for something she'd dropped years before. Children called her La Buscadora, the searcher. People crossed the street when she approached because she made them uncomfortable the way old grief does. Theos, an uncle who kept his distance from the more devotional parts of family life, was blunt about what happened next. "We thought someone was trying to get attention," he told me in a low voice. "We bought new locks. We put the rosary in a safe." It would not stay there. That night, the safe was unlatched and the rosary hung on the knob, beads splayed like a tiny, accusing necklace. The most frightening escalation involved the cross that hung above the bed. One night, Maria woke to the metal taste of fear in her mouth and the sound of something scraping the plaster above her. She reached instinctively toward the cross and felt a forceful tug so violent it nearly yanked the ring from her finger. The cross had been fastened with strong hooks. In the morning, the hook was bent as if something heavy had pulled on the chain. There were scratch marks on the wall, thin, straight lines, like someone had pressed keys into wet clay. Friends and family started to use language cautiously. "Old magic," said one aunt. "A binding," suggested a cousin who kept his religion tidy and his vocabulary tidier. None of these names helped. The scratching turned into pushes, objects nudged off counters, pictures tilted so severely frames threatened to fall. Each incident carried the same intimate quality. Items moved in ways that suggested attention rather than vandalism. Whoever or whatever was doing it engaged with the apartment's possessions as if cataloging what belonged to whom. Particularly unsettling were nights when only Maria could see the thing that followed her. Her husband would wake to silence. She would stand at the bedroom door and feel the floorboard under her heel thrum like a string under tension. In the doorway, there was the shape of a person made of dust and shadow. Sometimes it seemed to glow faintly at the edges, as if lit from within by a candle. Her husband, eyes still closed, would deny seeing anything. It made the haunting private and therefore crueler. In truth, a lot of family hauntings are about attention. They anchor to the places people touch and the objects people treat with care. But this one bore a different weight. It seemed to track Maria in a way that suggested unfinished business tied to lineage.
She told me about nights she dreamed of a little girl holding a rosary and saying her name in a child's voice. She later found a child's shoe, small and patched, under her porch stairs. No one she knew owned such a shoe. After months of escalations, Maria began to change. She stopped going out alone at night. She slept with the radio on. She circled her rosary 3 times before leaving the house, a nervous competence rather than devotion. Eventually, she and her husband moved. They left behind the brass knob, the curtains, the picture frames. The rosary went with them, but the scratches remained on the plaster like a signature. Sometimes the story grew legs. People in the old neighborhood began to report glimpses of a woman at the corner of the market who watched children too closely. The local priest refused to be quoted, which is usually a good sign that something is odd. What did Maria believe? That someone wanted to be remembered, she said, quiet now. Not hurt, just found. There is a peculiar moral in some attachings. The thing is not hunting you so much as asking you to remember. Whether that request is benign or manipulative depends on how it arrives, almost tender, almost aggressive. For Maria, it was both. It left her wary and worn, and it taught her the hardest lesson about living with an attention that does not grant consent. You keep the Polaroids, the jewelry, the soft things of memory, but someone else may still touch them when you're not looking. You might think the next stories will relax into objects and memories. They do and they don't.
The following chapter travels across oceans and into hotels and houses that are designed to be transitory, places where the past waits in the corners because new renters rarely brush enough dust away. Keep your seatbelt on. When travelers carry the world with them, sometimes the world comes back. Story 8. Rooms that remember. There is a humiliation to being a traveler. You accept that every bed is someone else's bed until it proves otherwise. These stories are 3 small fragments of that humiliation, the sense that some rooms refuse to forget the people who slept there before. The French Lodge was a gray building with wooden shutters and a front that leaned like a tired elder. A couple, Mark and Elise, had rented it for a short holiday, the sort of escape people take to pretend their lives can be simpler. The housekeeper handed over keys with the ritual of a local. She mentioned, almost as an apology, that the place had been empty for some time. "It keeps its memories," she said, smiling. The first night it was simply a child's toy left under the bed. Elise found a small tin soldier tucked beneath the mattress as if someone had hidden it. There were no children in the party renting. That was excusable. The second night, the bathroom bulb cracked with no one near it. The light shattered into a rain of glass that fell in a pattern, making the couple worry.
When Elise bent down with a torch to sweep the fragments, she found an old photograph glued to the floorboards with a smear of something faded. In the picture, a young man jumps from a window into a fountain. The corner of the image was scuffed, as if someone had tried to remove it. They left with haste, and with an impression of corridors that exhaled. When Mark glanced at the rear window, he thought he saw a small figure in a raincoat standing near the hedges, but when he called out, there was only the fogged breath of the world beyond. Travelers learn to laugh at these dims later. In the moment, rooms that remember will make you feel watched by a memory, not a person. The next vignette takes us to a British country house of sorts, the kind with too many spare rooms and the smell of old polish. A young man, call him Jamie, stayed in a borrowed attic bedroom while house-sitting for a friend. He liked the slanted ceiling because it made him feel like a hermit, which is how writers like to think they replenish themselves. On the second night, he woke to the sound of clothing being pulled from a wardrobe. He checked. Nobody else was in the house. On the floor, he found a sweater, rumpled as if someone had just left it hanging there. Jamie tells this part of the story with a disarming kind of humor. "I thought I'd left the place untidy," he says. But when he went downstairs for milk in the morning, he found a jumper draped over the stair banister that he did not own. In the sleeve of the sweater there was a note, a single word scrawled in a child's hand: "Stay." He left the house without collecting his mail. Finally, an Italian hotel that smelled like lemon oil and old carpet. A woman named Rosa booked a single night near a station because trains are cheap and schedules stubborn. She took a room with a shower that hung like an afterthought off the bathroom. She woke at 3 to the sound of the shower running. She wrapped herself and went in to stop it, but the cord hung still and dry. In the drain she found a child's marble, cloudy with age, lodged in the grate like a lost moon. When she checked out, she asked the clerk if children had stayed there before. The man looked at a ledger, his face flattening. "There was a boy," he said, after a pause. "Many years ago. He liked marbles." He would not elaborate. Rosa kept the marble in her purse for a long time. She said it felt warm, like someone had just released it from a hand. What ties these wanderings together is not geography, but a state. Rooms that will not release the movements of their past occupants. Hotels and lodges are repositories. People sleep and leave, but their gestures sometimes stay. Travelers are convenient witnesses because they notice things they won't have to explain to anyone tomorrow. They can leave hurriedly, and that absence becomes a new layer the house remembers.
These stories are gentler than some because they don't press you with weight at night. They simply remind you that not every place is neutral. You are often an addition to a longer sentence. Now, if you think the Wanderer's tales are only mildly unnerving, the next account pulls you back into families and the long, patient shape of a presence that makes a house its own. Story 9. The Lady in Black. Every family has stories that tells itself in low voices. This was one of those. An inheritance passed like chipped china, something you use but don't discuss at dinner. The Hazels lived in a high-ceilinged house with lace curtains and a swing set in the yard. To any passerby, they were ordinary. Inside, certain rooms held air that tasted older than the rest. The Lady in Black arrived for the family in the way long-term hauntings always begin. She was present long enough that after a while, people stopped calling her an event and began to call her an occupant. The first mention is always small, a shadow at the foot of a bed, clothing left folded just so. But that slow normalization is its own cruelty. The house adapted around her. She wore black, everyone said, as if she had stepped out of a photograph of a funeral. Sometimes she was a suggestion in the corner.
and sometimes she was an attention that hovered over drawers and mirrors. Children are merciful witnesses because they make no promises to disbelief. One of the Hazel's sons, young enough to believe in the literal, would set a cup of milk on the kitchen counter before bed for the lady. He later explained that she liked milk. The parents would laugh on the surface and a little less publicly fold the cup into the sink. There were practical consequences. Collars flattened overnight as if smoothed by hands. Candles left in alcoves burned half and then snuffed. And once a photograph had been repositioned so many times you could see the hairline crease where fingers must have lifted it. What made this haunting different was longevity. The lady in black did not strike and leave. She learned the rhythm of the household and interpolated herself into it. People talked about her as if she were a relative who'd overstayed hospitality. "She keeps things neat," an aunt said once, with something like appreciation that made everyone at the table fall quiet. The complicating turn came when a cousin, visiting from the city, took a photograph at a family reunion. Later, when they looked at the print, there was a dark shape near the back door that was not there when they had posed. It was a vertical absence, the size of a woman, and its edges were like ink bleeding on paper. In the same frame, a child's face was faintly doubled, as if two people had overlapped for a second and only the one in black kept the outline. Some members of the family responded with ritual.
Not rites of exorcism, nothing sensational, just small acts meant to be respectful. A blanket left folded on a chair, a hymn hummed once on Sundays, a pinch of salt in the corners. Whether these gestures helped or merely acknowledged presence is impossible to say. The house felt more reconciled when the family was considerate of her, and less so when they argued late into the night. The crescendo came one winter evening. A teenage girl, Laura, woke to the sound of crying in the hallway. When she walked out, the house was a geometry of moonlight and breath. The lady in black stood at the top of the stairs, and for the first time she was visible in detail. A dress of matte fabric, hair pulled back like a ribbon, face pale and closed. Laura told me she remembered the smell more than anything else, stale lavender and dust. When Laura approached, the lady reached as if to smooth Laura's hair. Laura screamed, not a childish shriek, but a startled adult sound, and the figure vanished like a photograph burned from one corner. The family gathered, and in the wake of that night, the lady's interactions became less benign. Lamps went out in groups, drawers jammed from the inside. A child's favorite doll was found with one eye gouged, as if someone had pressed a thumb hard into its postic face. The final unnerving thing was the way people grew used to her presence. Households are adaptive systems. They modify their behavior around persistent anomalies. People in the Hazels' neighborhood stopped knocking on their light bulbs and started leaving a shadow on the back porch, as if to give the lady a place to sit. That normalization feels almost worse than raw fear, because it robs an event of outrage and turns it into domestic routine. Was the lady in black sorrowful or dangerous? The family could not agree. Some swore she was grieving, tethered to a loss. Others believed she was a boundary, teaching them how to live around an absence. The house itself kept both stories. On the last day I spoke with an elder in the family, she said quietly, "She only ever touched what she understood." That answer, half explanation, half resignation, resonates in a way ghost stories often do. What we cannot flush out, we accommodate. Before we head into the last story, a small promise. The next one collects the sharpest pieces, prophetic sightings that spared lives by terror, creatures that glow with eyes like coal, and small objects that suddenly become weapons. If you want something that makes you check your mirror twice, the finale is for you. Story 10, Eyes on the Highway. If the other stories collected scenes of domestic attachment, this one collects moments when a sight or sensation demanded immediate action, when the unknown did not linger politely, but reached across a moment and pulled someone from danger or into it. The red Ford Vision is the strangest kind of mercy.
In a rural stretch, where lanes run between fields and the night is thin and absolute, a woman named Ellen was driving home late after visiting relatives. The road was a ribbon of wet tarmac and Milky Way. She swore to me later that she had been thinking about nothing, about soup, about the cat, when a sudden image entered her vision, a red Ford barreling into her lane in 3 seconds. It was like seeing a slice of film inserted into reality. Ellen swerved as if responding to the glimpse. She missed the oncoming vehicle by inches. Later, police found an upturned red Ford in a hedge a mile ahead, its driver unconscious but alive. This is the sort of sight people hate to claim because it suggests a knowingness that sits outside their mind. Ellen's story does not suggest a comfort so much as urgency. The image didn't feel friendly, it felt like a warning. When she told friends they asked if she'd had a hallucination, she noted with wry relief that her seatbelt was still blackened at the point she'd gripped it, a physicality that tempered the rumor of mere imagination. Another story. A man named Roy, traveling across Appalachia, pulled into a truck stop to sleep in his cab. He liked to stop at 24-hour diners because the light made the parking lot feel watchful. In the drizzle, he saw a figure by the pumps with eyes like lanterns, 2 yellow points that glanced and then moved. The sight made his dog, an old Labrador, go rigid and then scream, a strangled whine that made Roy's teeth ache. Roy watched as the yellow lights drifted behind a truck, as if someone leaned in to peer, and then vanished. He left immediately. There are reports of animals being more attuned than humans to the presence of a spirit. Dogs wake and howl at rooms where no human senses a thing. Horses refuse to move near certain trees. In Roy's case, the dog's alarm was as persuasive as any evidence. People who swear by animal indicators do so because animals have less vocabulary to lie. They responded with a human prudence, a hurried departure, a choice never to park at that stop again. Objects can be aggressive too. A story I was told involved a man who, mid-apartment move, felt something yank his wedding ring off his finger. The force was described as quick, intimate, not malicious but determined. He watched it fly across the floor and embed itself in the leg of the sofa, as if caught by a hook in the upholstery. He left without the ring and later found it under the seat of a bus, warm as if someone had just held it. He took it to a pawn shop and walked away. There was a sadness to his story. Attachment sometimes returns by force. Then there was the throw of the Sacred Heart. In a house where a family had devotional objects on mantels, a small hand-sized Sacred Heart, painted, gold-rimmed, suddenly flew from a shelf in midday and struck the window, cracking the glass and embedding a shard into the sill. No one was near the fireplace when it happened.
The family said later that the hurt was not physical so much as a breach. The object had been a neutral talisman, and suddenly it had become a projectile. The animal-sensed story that stayed with me most involves a dog and a cemetery. A man walking his dog, Ben, noticed the dog fix on a particular crumbling plot, staring as if it's something 100 feet away. The dog whimpered. When Ben peered over the wall, he thought he saw a small figure, a child no taller than a gate, standing between the stones. The child turned its head toward Ben and lifted a hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. When Ben blinked, the figure was gone. Local lore tied the plot to a child who had been buried in the late 19th century and whose death had been sudden, a fever, an epidemic, a paper-thin destiny. Whether the dog saw memory or residue is unknowable. The dog refused to walk that side of the park afterwards. Another story closes this anthology because it refuses to be tidy. A young man on an overnight journey felt his hand go numb, as if someone had taken hold of his finger and yanked. When he glanced down, his ring had been pulled from his finger and thrown across the aisle of a sleeping train into darkness. He chased after it and found the ring lodged under the step where the janitor stowed his cart, glinting in a puddle of tea. Passengers said later the light in that carriage behaved oddly the whole night, stuttering like a camera. These episodes share a quality. They broke the flow of ordinary life and made decision urgent. They didn't sit in corners. They demanded response, swerve, flee, pick up what was thrown. The line between protection and menace is thin. You can tell yourself a ghost helped you avoid an accident, and you can tell yourself another pushed you toward it. The narratives accommodate both readings. As the dawn draws near in this recording, I've been collecting threads. A grandfather that watches beside a crib, a shadow that presses against a mirror, a girl who will not be erased, toys that change places on their own, a leathery presence in a worn chapel, an attachment that follows across borders, rooms that remember strangers, a lady who lives like an extra in a family photo, and sudden interventions on the highway. 10 ways the dark speaks. When you collect this many versions of the same thing, attention without consent, memory that refuses to be private, you begin to see certain patterns. Hauntings like to hang where things are left easy, on objects, in doorways, along thresholds. They like children because children are porous with imagination and grief. They keep their distance from busy households and find the quietest rooms to settle into. Most importantly, they make your house and life feel smaller and larger at once. Smaller because someone else also inhabits it. Larger because it becomes part of a wider geography of remembering. There is no clean lesson.
I don't offer a cure because I can't in good faith guarantee one. What I can offer is a simple piece of practical wisdom, born of speaking to people who live with these questions. Treat these events with respect and caution. Keep your own boundaries, And if you must keep an object that brings discomfort, understand you carry its history when you move. Final reflection. When you lie awake and hear the house rearrange itself, remember this: a lot of what we call haunting is just memory meeting the present in ways that make us uneasy. Some things watch because they're tender. Some watch because they are angry. Some are only motions left in the grain of wood. None of it is neat. If these stories kept you awake, or if you have a small thing that moves on its own, or an odd noise at 2 in the morning that your house excuses as settling, you are not alone. There are more stories like these, lines of testimony stretched across bathrooms and train seats and nursery cribs. They bind us to a world that is sometimes more porous than we'd like. They ask us to look longer at the corners, and to answer, if only for our own peace, what it is we are looking at. If any of these held you in their teeth, if the image of a small shoe on a bench or a yellow pair of eyes at a truck stop followed you out of the room, tell someone. If you want to share, leave your story in the comments. If you like hearing these, subscribe for more. There are always more pieces of the night waiting to be told. I'll leave you with a small piece of advice I never give lightheartedly. When you switch off your lamp tonight, listen for the house as if it were speaking a language you don't yet understand. In the morning, if the cup is moved or the rosary lies on the sink, don't assume malice. Assume memory. Assume attention. Sometimes attention is a kindness. Sometimes it is the opposite. Good night, and check the corners before you sleep. Until dawn.